Welcome to Unbroken and Unbreakable, a discussion of life without bondage. When I was a young man, I struggled with the same things that most men struggle with, namely pornography. But as a young man, the thing I struggled with most is shame. It actually took over my life for 10 years, between the ages of 20 and 30. I'm quite a bit older now, so now I have a lot I can look back on and see what happened to me back then. The issue started in my 20s when I was going to this small church that was charismatic in nature. They had a Sunday school program where we were reading through scripture, and every week we'd have a chance to share what God had spoken to us throughout the week. And I would take the time to spend a lot of time with the Lord because I didn't really have a job, so there was not a whole lot left for me to do. So I'd spend my days seeking God, reading scripture. We were going through the book of 1 John. The weird thing that happened to me was, as we were going through the book of 1 John, God started showing me all these different realities, these different revelations about intimacy and connection with Him, about knowing Him in a deeper way. And they took over my life. And for 3 months, I didn't wrestle with porn. I didn't wrestle with any sin. It's like sin just disappeared out of my life completely. I radically changed who I was. But I also was using the revelations I was getting from God to try to grow myself and get people's approval. At one point I realized what I was doing, and this caused me tremendous shame. As a matter of fact, it caused me to shut down and pull away from God. Then for 10 years I hid from God in the back of the church, working the sound booth. I still had all these deeper revelations about the voice of God and relationship and becoming free from sin and not having bondage in your life, but I was very ashamed of myself. I was very full of self-hatred. I needed God's help. One day the pastor came to me and told me that God had spoken to him and told him to make me the youth pastor. So he put me in charge of the teenagers, and I started teaching them about how a relationship with God is really possible, how you can have deep, meaningful, joyful relationship with Him, deep encounters, hearing His voice, seeing His face, discovering His love, and that it was all actually easier than we had all been led to believe. But yet I was actually still hiding. I was still ashamed of myself. I was afraid I was going to keep using the revelations I carried to make room for myself, to make way for myself, to celebrate myself. I quickly realized that if I was going to teach teenagers how to hear the voice of God and develop a relationship with Him, that they needed to have their own personal encounter. And I needed to be able to lead by example. So I decided to hide myself away in the intercessor's room twice a week, praying and seeking God's face, looking for deliverance from this issue I had created for myself. I knew in my mind that there was nothing real about what I believed. And what I believed was this, that if I got too close to God, one day He would look at me and say, "Jason, I've had enough of you. I'm tired of you." That's why I was hiding. That's what this fear was. So I got alone in the intercessor's room twice a week, would spend a couple hours in prayer, asking God to speak, show me through scripture, talk to me about what was real and what was not real. And within a few weeks, God answered my prayer. Now I'm going to explain how I hear God's voice so that this can become a part of your life. I will open up my Bible and turn to the table of contents and then ask God where does He want me to go? And whatever seems like it's highlighted, whatever feels like it's jumping off the page, I'll turn to that verse, to that scripture. I'll scan through the Bible verses until one pops up, and then once I can begin to understand what He's saying, once something begins to formulate in my mind, then that's what I'll begin writing down. So this is what I was doing in the intercessor's room. Going to the table of contents, asking God what He wants me to read, finding the verse He highlighted, looking it up, and then discovering what it has to say, and then asking Him the question, what is He trying to say to me? So the first thing He took me to is a story of Peter being called as a disciple. And in this verse, Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law, and the next day, He shows up where Peter has been working all night trying to catch fish to make money. And they had been fishing all night and haven't caught anything. And Jesus, after preaching to a crowd, turns around and looks at James, John, and Peter and says, "Let's go out for a catch." Peter says, "We've been fishing all night, haven't caught anything, but at your word we will." So they head out into their boats and let down their nets, and their nets fill with fish. So much so that Peter has to call James and John over to drag these nets to the shore. And they get them pulled to the shore, and Peter falls on his knees and says, "Leave me alone, I'm a sinner." Now immediately I'm reading the scripture and I realize that God is talking to me because He's told me to look up a verse that is exactly about what I'm struggling with. Then I say, "God, what are you trying to say to me?" And He says, "Look up this other verse." And this verse ended up in the Old Testament. And it's a story of Samuel, of Elijah, actually, not Samuel. Elijah caused a famine, prophesied a famine over the entire nation of Israel. And he is been eating by the brook called Cherith. And ravens are bringing him meat at night and during the day to eat. And then the brook dries up and the ravens stop coming. And then the voice of God comes to Elijah and says, "I've commanded a widow woman over in Sidon to provide for you." So Elijah goes to Sidon and meets this woman at a well. And he says, "Give me something to eat and give me something to drink." She draws water for him, but then says, "I don't have anything for you to eat. I have one cake left for me and my son. We're going to eat it and then die." And then Elijah persists. And so she decides to give him half. And Elijah comes to her house and multiplies the oil and flour. And they're able to sustain throughout the rest of this famine. Then one day, the widow woman comes running up to Elijah and says, "Did you come to remind me of my sin?" Elijah goes up to where the boy has died and lays on him and raises him from the dead. Now, having read these two stories, and in my younger days I didn't know enough about Scripture to find them, I can immediately tell that these two stories are the same story. You have this man of God who shows up and performs a miracle, demonstrating his love. And then he performs a second miracle, and the circumstances of this second miracle cause this shame response to come out of the person. And they say, I'm a sinner. And I'm looking at these two stories in my mind, and I know immediately that these two stories are identical and that they're about me, and they're basically my story. So I say, God, what is it you want to say to me? And he says, Jason, you're just like Peter. You think I'm going to reject you for your sin, but I was chasing Peter, and I'm chasing you, and I'm not going to stop till I catch you. This broke shame off my life, and I worshiped God for an hour, tears pouring down my face as I realized that he was a good father, and I didn't have to stay broken. That he loved me enough to carry this burden and forgive me of my pain, of my shame, of my guilt, and lift me up out of that. And he still was saying, I want you. In that moment, I realized that this God is real, more real than I could have possibly ever imagined. He's a father, a true father, that he wants us, that he loves his children, that he adores us, that he loves me. Since that time, I've had 5 total encounters, 4 other ones after that. Many small encounters, but 5 total major encounters that shifted my identity. He's dealt with anger, he's dealt with shame, he's dealt with poverty. He's dealt with pornography. And he's dealt with self-hatred. And I've discovered when he finished dealing with the last one, he said to me, Jason, what else can you do this with? And I began realizing that this relationship I had with God was setting me free. And the only thing I ever had to do was hear what he had to say and believe him.